Right, no apologies for starting with this. There's been a lot of opposition for us to get here. And it's been a great and extraordinary week for leadership to be celebrated. And I imagine that all of us here have been delighted in the success of the England Lionesses, let alone the skill of their manager, Sarina Wiegman. There she is. What a fabulous result for England, for football and for women. Now, I Googled her to find out if she had a Christian faith. What I found out was that 52-year-old Sarina is Dutch. She played football from the age of 6. She's married to Martin Glotzbach and has 2 children. And if you would like to have her look, you can go to Marks & Spencer's and get the jacket and trousers that she wears for £67.50. Apparently their sales are up by 140%. But I couldn't actually find out whether she had a faith or not. In my previous career as a head teacher, I studied leadership and the personalities who had methods that really helped us to make a difference in the way we led. For example, in training at 2 of my schools, I looked at Dave Brailsford. If you remember, he was the incredibly successful British cycling coach. He was innovative, and he came out with this wonderful thing about the concept of the maximisation of marginal gains. And I used that really successfully in those schools. So I was particularly focusing as well on whether Sarina Wiegman could offer anything for leaders today. She was being praised for being calm, clear and direct, not shy to be savage and brutal when needed, a catalyst for the team, which she skillfully bonds to be one big family, and for her sense of humour. But there was no concrete concept yet to grab onto and work into our team management situations. I bet, though, that there's a book that will follow that will actually have that in it. However, all these leaders have overcome substantial problems, from realising the vision, communicating the vision, struggling to get resources, and then empowering people, leading the team, and overcoming opposition. Aha! Sounds a little like our dear friend Nehemiah. And the one thing that Nehemiah clearly has that none of these other famous leaders appear to have is God, and a calling to do God's work. Do you know, I wish that I had looked more closely at Nehemiah and his leadership style when I was leading a school. He's a terrific role model for overcoming obstacles. So we're going to look at that a bit more closely. Let me first recap the story so far, though. So we've been looking at Nehemiah through the lens of our newly discerned and thought through values that underpin us. And we are now using Nehemiah to help us move forward with our vision. We're working out what our next steps are as individuals and as church, and what that should be. As Lorraine said last week, what are the key kingdom principles to help us build our faith and God's kingdom here at Christ Church and beyond? So in chapter 1, the overriding message was that God's call begins in the heart. We saw how Nehemiah's heart broke when he heard about the state of affairs in Jerusalem, and how he takes that burden to God in serious prayer, and how he becomes the answer to his own prayer. In chapter 2, we see the action starting. Not knee-jerk action, but action in God's timing. We hear of Nehemiah asking God to guide him every step of the way. And particular mention was made by Jan and Lorraine last week of that wonderful arrow prayer when Nehemiah has to answer the king on the spot, the prayer that asks God for the right words to say. Then we see God's generosity beyond expectation, and we recognised that at Christ Church we do not lack anything either. And last week we had the wondrous list of all the diverse people who were beginning to build the wall. And as we drew out the key principle of us needing to work together, we looked also at the vision, and the vision of the wall that starts to become a reality in Nehemiah. The individuals being named helped us to recognise that God knows each one of us by name, and each one of us is valued. and each one of us has a part to play. And this week, just when you thought everything was going beautifully smoothly, the opposition starts. And we're going to look at how Nehemiah and each one of us should respond to that opposition. This week, the story unfolds like a film script. The chapter begins with another appearance of the villains that we saw in chapter 2. Do you remember Sanballat, Geshem, and Tobiah, who had despised what Nehemiah had planned to do, and they jeered at the Jews? Now that the construction project is actually underway and good progress is being made, they are feeling even more threatened by it. So they up the ante, and their jeering and sarcasm becomes worse. You can imagine a picture of the Sumerian army who accompanied Sanballat, laughing and ridiculing the Jewish wall builders. I think Tobiah the Ammonite takes the prize for the greatest insult. And you look at the wall here, and you just hear that again. Don't you just love it when he looks at it and he points at it and he says that even a dainty fox walking on it will make it collapse anyway? And by now for us, it's no surprise that Nehemiah responds in prayer. And it's a very violent and unforgiving prayer. But the age that they're in is violent and unforgiving. And don't forget the Nehemiah and the Jewish team's viewpoint, they are actually being ridiculed, and they're ridiculing God as well as the workers on the wall. They're mocking faith and their identity. And there's a big difference in this prayer, the first prayer of Nehemiah's and this one, because this one, Nehemiah is actually using it as a corporate prayer. Hear, O God, for we are despised. Turn back the taunt on their own heads. So suddenly that prayer was probably said aloud in front of those workers, and it would have been a huge encouragement as well as prayer. So they finish praying and ignore their enemies and get back to work. However, the enemies become further enraged when the wall has reached half its height and has become nearly joined up. They get together and they plot to fight against Jerusalem with the idea of causing chaos and confusion. And Nehemiah responds again by prayer. So we prayed to our God and set a guard as protection against them day and night. One of the commentaries I read on this said that they prayed for God's protection, but they also used their sanctified common sense, and they took appropriate actions to protect themselves. I think that actually many of us find it quite difficult to get the right balance between relying upon God and leaving him to work and actually taking the necessary action. But here's a great example of that balance being struck right. The prayers don't make the opposition go away. Indeed, the stress begins to get to the Jews, and they complain that people's strength is waning, the rubbish around the rubble of the wall is too challenging, it would be easy for their enemies to creep up on them and kill them as they're working. And then the Jews that live locally come 10 times and say, come away, come back to us. Perhaps the enemies had succeeded in getting the focus of the people off from God and on the task that he'd given them. They were discouraged by fatigue, by frustration, and by fear. But Nehemiah doesn't panic. He puts into action the plan to set a guard to protect the people. And with the scarce resources available, he places armed people in the most vulnerable places. But he does something even more important. He encourages the people by reminding them that God was with them and they could depend upon him as they protected their families and homes. And thus encouraged, the people returned to work. Half of them worked on the construction, and half held spears and shields and bows and body armor. And again, we get a great cinematic picture of the, it said material carriers, I think, on the reading, but burden bearers carrying their loads with one hand, and on the other hand, having a sword or weapon of some sorts. And all the builders having swords strapped at their sides. The people worked even harder now that they'd dealt with their discouragement. Instead of just working until sundown, They continued until the stars came out at night, and then they spent the night there guarding their building work. So when you ponder this summary, what's so clear here is that on the surface, this chapter deals with the discouragement that came from opposition to rebuilding a wall. But as we kept finding in the preceding chapters of Nehemiah, the deeper issue is how God is building his people, individually, corporately, and as church today. So what is the relevance of this for us today? Firstly, as I've said, we're working on our vision, and we are doing everything that we can to ensure that the work we do is God's will, God's work. And we have a heart for this. When we join in with God's work, we shouldn't be surprised that we're going to face opposition. In our reading, it looks like Sanballat and Tobiah are the true enemies of Nehemiah. But this isn't just an earthly attack, it's spiritual. And who was really behind the spiritual attack? The real enemy behind Sanballat and Tobiah is evil, the devil. The devil and his minions work through ordinary people to oppose God's plan on this earth. In John 10:10, we hear of that thief that comes only to steal and kill and destroy. And we hear how Jesus comes so that we may have life and life to the full. As we join in God's work, trying to ensure that we have life to the full and that we are giving life to our neighbours to the full, we often come under attack, individually or a church. So our battle is not against flesh and blood, and we thank Paul for putting this into words. We have the next slide, thank you. In Ephesians 6, he writes, "A final word. Be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on all of God's armour so that you will be able to stand firm against all strategies of the devil. For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places." Fortunately, Paul also gives us the tools to help with this. Put on the full armour of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, and pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. At a home group long ago, I remember being tasked to draw ourselves with all our armour on, labelling it carefully like this example, to help us remember the tools that we have at hand and the tools that we should develop. Over the years, when things have gone wrong, when I feel under attack spiritually, I picture it, and from the picture, I actually physically put on that armour. I had a friend called Susie, who was also in that home group, and I was a friend of hers for many, many years before she shared with me that each morning she prayed the armour of God on herself and on me. What an amazing gift that is from a friend. I really felt that she was ensuring that God had my back. Let's encourage ourselves to do this. The wonderful hanging that we've got here that Bab did quite a few years ago now, it's absolutely fantastic. She was just telling me earlier on that it's appeared online. It's gone all over the world, this picture of this hanging. But when you see it, when Lorraine saw it when it first came up, and she remarked on it and said, "Oh wow, what a great reminder that is to pray our armour on, and that we are in more than just a battle on earth, it's a spiritual battle as well." So it's a wonderful reminder when we see it as we sit here to just put our armour on. And now let's follow Nehemiah's response to opposition. Prayer, prayer, prayer. We need to recognise that our becoming a mature disciple of Jesus is a lifelong project that will occasionally be hit by discouragement. And actually, Lorraine, you hit on that just when you came up impromptu and sort of shared what you did. There are times when you may not feel connected to God, that prayer seems dry, nothing seems comfortable. It may be as a result of something traumatic, but it can just also be when you're desperately trying to move spiritually and you don't feel you're moving at all or walking with Jesus. So taking a leaf out of Nehemiah's book, how can we effectively deal with discouragement in both our journey and the journey going forward for Christ Church? Well, we can respond to God before we respond to the opposition. Nehemiah's example of praying before everything and being extreme, rather than rushing off to the library or Googling ways for spiritual fulfillment, just pray. Tell God how you feel. Be prepared to wait and trust that you are heard. We can also remember that God is greater than our problems. In the middle of everything that goes wrong, when people are ridiculing you for your belief or whatever, it may be that our focus becomes centred round ourselves rather than God-centred. So let's follow that pattern set by Nehemiah. Rather than trying to prove ourselves or justify ourselves, keep our eyes on God. Remind ourselves of that and remind those around us of that too. When we're on the end of those harsh words, don't swap insults. Indeed, we're told by Jesus, "But I tell you, you who hear me, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you." Nehemiah responds with a prayer and leaves the judgment and revenge to God. At no time did he attempt to bring them down a notch. And how about we remove the rubbish? The workers were frustrated because all of the rubbish that was in the way, in between the boulders, they had to move it, and it was hard work. I wonder how true that can be of our lives. Has our spiritual journey got sidetracked or even been brought to a screeching halt because of some rubbish in our life that needs to be cleared out? Sometimes rubbish is obvious, perhaps a sin that we're dealing with. Sometimes it's something that's just distracting us from our walk with Jesus. In Hebrews 12:1, it says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witness, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." So let's get rid of anything that's holding us back. So, do we give up? No, like Nehemiah, we review and replan. Perhaps our tendency is to bail out when the going gets tough. Well, that's not what Nehemiah did. When you have that amazing idea that will take your home group forward or create a new church activity, whatever it is, and you feel that your heart has been moved by God and you're called to do this, but you're coming up with brick walls that appear unmovable, give up? Nehemiah revised their plans and reallocated the resources they had. We should be encouraged to pray and then make a careful evaluation of our situation and adopt a different approach. We may need to reinforce our weak areas. Nehemiah did just that. Where the wall was lowest, he allocated additional resources, and he set up the plan so that even though people were separated from each other and they could then be summoned to aid their fellow Jews if they were attacked. Probably most of us have a pretty good idea of where our weak areas are in our lives. And perhaps our vision work will enable us to see where as a church we have weak areas. But we can't just be satisfied with identifying them. We have to have concrete plans to deal with those weaknesses and put those concrete plans into action. One of the articles I read regarding this section of Nehemiah I found particularly helpful, especially when you think about how we at Christ Church may be praying and trying to discern our way forward. Perhaps it is you that's come up with the idea, a source of discouragement a source, I can't say discouragement, it's coming out as discouragement. A source of discouragement then for both you and our church could be when others trash talk it. And we see this illustrated in this chapter when Sanballat was ticked off. He was the governor of a nearby territory who no doubt feared the potential of a strong Jerusalem emerging as a big threat to his territory. So as the Jews became more serious about the project, he becomes more upset about it and resorts to this trash talk. So from the article, the examples it gave was, if you want to trash talk someone, put down their qualities. And in his case it was, what are those feeble Jews doing? If you want to trash talk someone, put down their ambitions. Will they restore their wall? If you want to trash talk someone, put down their optimism. Will they offer sacrifices? If you want to trash talk someone, try to tear down their enthusiasm. Will they finish in a day? If you want to trash talk someone, try to tear down their confidence. Can they bring the stones back to life? And as I read this, I became so aware that taking the opposite view is how we should be doing things. We need to build up people's qualities, build up their ambitions, build up their optimism, build up their enthusiasm and their confidence. We need to be proud to have those qualities in our own personalities. Indeed, Jesus built up his disciples to have these qualities throughout the gospel stories. So instead of us being sources of discouragement and trashing, we have to turn that trash talk around to be encouraging. So how do we deal with the discouragement? Remember first that our God is more awesome and powerful than we can ever imagine. 1 John 4:4 tells us the battle is already won. Little children, you are of God and have overcome them, for he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. Pray, plan, be positive, remember the Lord, be prepared, build each other up. Nehemiah listened and reacted, and perhaps a lesson for each of us leaders here in particular. How good are you at really listening? When someone is describing what they think would be great for the church to do, and you hear the first bit, and something jumps into your mind as an objection straight away, and you can't wait to get that out before they finish speaking, and you're busy wording it so what you're going to say, so it sounds as though you really care about what they're saying, you don't want to put them down, but actually they're wrong, and you just end up interrupting them and saying what you want to say without hearing exactly what it is that they've said and the reasons behind what they've said, the things that we could build on. You didn't listen enough to pray afterwards whether that was God's will or not. Hands up, I know I am guilty of that one. So in conclusion, we've been looking at our vision, we've articulated our vision, our values, and we're ready to move into action. So we can expect opposition from within our church and from outside of our church. So we need to deal with it when it arises and not be discouraged. We need to keep our focus on our awesome God, keep praying, and achieve a balance between praying, leaving things to God, and taking action. And keep reminding ourselves of whose work we're doing. Keep building each other up and moving forward in prayerful action. Put on the armour of God daily. Each of us needs to examine our own conscience and be aware when we're not listening. Be aware when we trash talk. We need to remember that we're part of a team, part of the body of Christ, and resolutely walk forward doing our bit, individually or as a church, to bring in God's kingdom. Let's step forward for God. Amen.